The town of Ravenwood sat at the edge of an ancient forest, where the trees twisted into unnatural shapes and the air seemed heavy with secrets. At its heart lay a forgotten cemetery, its iron gates rusted shut and the tombstones tilted, half sunken into the soil like jagged teeth. No one spoke of it openly, but every resident knew of its grim reputation. Whispers of strange sounds, shadowy figures, and vanishing travelers were passed down through generations. Rachel Ward, a freelance journalist desperate for her next story, wasn't one to be deterred by rumors. Freshly heartbroken and drowning in unpaid bills, she had stumbled upon an old article mentioning the cemetery's cursed history. A mass grave from the 1800s, mysterious deaths, and sightings of pale figures walking among the graves. This was the kind of story that could launch her career. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, Rachel ventured to Ravenwood home on a crisp October evening, drawn by a promise of answers and fame. The air was colder than it should have been as she approached the cemetery. Tendrils of fog crawled across the ground, swirling unnaturally around her boots. She reached the gate, her gloved hands trembling as she pushed it open with a groan that seemed to echo far too loudly in the stillness. The graveyard was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Her flashlight beam danced across cracked headstones, names eroded by time. Just stories, Rachel muttered to herself, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. But as she walked deeper into the cemetery, she noticed something strange. The fog grew denser, pooling around certain graves as if alive. She crouched by one, her fingers brushing a cracked plaque. The name was illegible, but a faint, whispering sound seemed to rise from the ground. Rachel's heart raced. "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice wavered, swallowed by the mist. She clicked her camera, the flash illuminating the tombstone for a split second. When the light faded, her breath hitched. Was that a figure standing behind her? She spun around, but the path was empty. "Pull it together," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the whispers grew louder now, not words, but a rising cacophony of murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. Rachel stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, and the air seemed to press against her, suffocating and cold. And then she saw it. A figure stood a few yards away, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and gaunt, its head tilted unnaturally. A low, guttural noise escaped its lips, a sound that didn't seem human. Rachel froze, every instinct screaming at her to run. But her legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, and the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Rachel turned and bolted, the fog clutching at her ankles like grasping hands. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, breathless and trembling. Slamming the door shut, she fumbled with her keys, glancing back at the cemetery. The fog had receded, and the gate now stood eerily closed. Her camera rested on the passenger seat. Hands shaking, she replayed the last photo she had taken. There, in the frame, was the figure, a pale, eyeless face staring directly into the lens. Rachel couldn't sleep that night. The photo on her camera was burned into her mind. A figure too grotesque to explain, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. She had uploaded the image to her laptop, enlarging it to see if it was a trick of the fog or a camera glitch. But the figure was unmistakable. Its waxy, distorted face seemed to stare directly at her. It was too real to dismiss. By morning, Rachel's curiosity had wrestled her fear into submission. She decided to return to the cemetery, armed this time with research. Staring at the laptop screen in her small motel room, she scoured the town's archives. Ravenwood's history was a dark one. The cemetery had been used for plague victims in the 1800s, many of whom were buried in unmarked graves. But what stood out most was a name she came across repeatedly: Silas Reed, the cemetery's long-dead caretaker who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Local legends claimed he still wandered the grounds, guiding lost souls or trapping them. "That's ridiculous," Rachel muttered, though her hands trembled as she closed the laptop. Legends or not, she felt compelled to return. Something about the whispers, the fog, and that figure gnawed at her rational mind. She needed to see it again, to prove to herself that there was a logical explanation. By late afternoon, she found herself standing once more at the rusted gates. The fog had returned, curling lazily around the tombstones, like a predator waiting to strike. Rachel hesitated, gripping her camera tightly. "It's just a story," she whispered to herself, stepping inside. As she wandered deeper into the cemetery, the air grew colder, biting at her skin even through her jacket. She aimed her camera at a cluster of headstones, snapping photos. Each click of the shutter echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back as if the cemetery were a hollow shell. Then she heard it again. A whisper, faint and disjointed. "Who's there?" she called, her voice breaking. She whipped around, her flashlight slicing through the fog. Nothing. But the whispering grew louder, rising and falling like a chant. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight caught movement. A shadow darted between the graves, too fast to be human. "Hey!" Rachel shouted, her voice thick with fear. She broke into a jog, chasing after it. The fog seemed to part before her, revealing a small mausoleum she hadn't noticed before. Its stone facade was cracked and covered in ivy, the door slightly ajar. Rachel hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. Against her better judgment, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of rot. Her flashlight illuminated dusty shelves lined with urns, their labels too worn to read. And then she saw it. Another figure, huddled in the corner. This one was different. It was small, childlike. Its back turned to her. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she managed, her voice trembling. The figure moved. Slowly, it turned its head to face her. Its face was pale, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that split its cheeks. Its eyes were black voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward as the figure crawled toward her on all fours, its movements jerky and inhuman. She dropped her flashlight in her panic, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. She bolted from the mausoleum, her camera swinging against her chest. The whispers erupted again, louder this time, almost angry. Rachel didn't stop running until she reached the cemetery gates, slamming them shut behind her. She collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. When she finally dared to check her camera, her stomach turned. Every photo she had taken inside the cemetery now showed the same thing. The grinning childlike figure, growing closer with each frame, until its face filled the lens in the final shot. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at the sequence of photos. The childlike figure, its twisted grin and hollow eyes, seemed to mock her from the screen. She shut the laptop abruptly, as though closing it could banish the images from her mind. But no matter how tightly she shut her eyes, the figure's face lingered, burned into her thoughts. By dawn, her fear was overtaken by anger and frustration. She was a journalist, a seeker of truth. Whatever was happening in Ravenwood Cemetery wasn't supernatural. It couldn't be. "There's an explanation," she muttered to herself, packing her bag with more equipment. Extra batteries, a thermal camera, and a recorder. She wouldn't leave until she uncovered the truth, no matter how much it terrified her. Before heading out, Rachel decided to visit the Ravenwood Historical Society, hoping to find more information about Silas Reed. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Mayhew, raised an eyebrow when Rachel mentioned the cemetery. "You'd do well to leave that place alone," she said sharply. "Why?" Rachel pressed, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Mrs. Mayhew hesitated before pulling out an old leather-bound book. Silas Reed was the caretaker during the plague years. He lived on the grounds, tending to the dead. But when the bodies started disappearing, people turned on him. They said he was performing rituals, trying to bring the dead back to life. Her voice dropped. They never found him. But some say he's still there, guarding the graves and punishing those who disturb them. Rachel flipped through the book, her heart pounding. It was filled with crude sketches and diary entries, detailing strange occurrences at the cemetery. Whispers, moving shadows, and figures lurking in the fog. One entry, dated 1862, caught her eye. The keeper watches. He calls the dead to him, and they obey. They whisper warnings, but none listen until it's too late. Chilled but determined, Rachel returned to the cemetery as the sun dipped below the horizon. The fog was heavier this time, clinging to her skin like cold breath. The whispers began almost immediately, faint and unintelligible. She ignored them, focusing instead on finding the truth. She made her way to the mausoleum again, the flashlight in one hand and her camera in the other. The door creaked open as if expecting her. Inside, the air was even colder than before, and her breath puffed in white clouds. She set up her recorder and began speaking. "If there's anyone here, show yourself. I just want to understand what's happening." The whispers intensified, swirling around her in a chaotic symphony. She turned in every direction, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. Then she saw him, Silas Reed. He stood in the far corner of the mausoleum, his skeletal frame draped in tattered clothes. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Why are you here?" Rachel demanded, her voice shaking. Silas tilted his head, his bony hand reaching out toward her. "You've disturbed them," he rasped, his voice hollow and otherworldly. "They will not forgive." Rachel's knees nearly buckled as the walls of the mausoleum began to pulse, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. She turned to run, but the doorway vanished, replaced by solid stone. The whispers became deafening, forming words now. "Stay. Stay with us." The fog seeped into the mausoleum, rising like a living thing. Silas took a step closer, his glowing eyes locked on hers. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice layered with echoes. Rachel raised her camera in desperation, snapping photo after photo. The flash illuminated the room in staccato bursts, revealing not just Silas, but dozens of figures behind him. Men, women, and children, their faces pale and eyeless, their mouths stretched in silent screams. "I don't belong here!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw. She felt the fog wrap around her ankles, pulling her downward. Her body was freezing, her limbs heavy. She clawed at the air, desperate for escape, as the figures closed in. And then, everything went black. Rachel awoke to silence. Her body ached as though she had been dragged across rough terrain. She opened her eyes to pitch-black darkness. Panic gripped her as she realized she was lying on damp, cold earth. She groped around, her fingers brushing against rough stone walls. The air was suffocating, thick with the scent of decay. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling as she turned it on. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel, its walls lined with roots that writhed as if alive. Her camera was gone, but the recorder was still clipped to her jacket, its red light blinking. She hit play, and her own voice filled the space, trembling and desperate. "If there's anyone here, show yourself," she heard herself say. Then came the whispers, louder than she remembered, followed by Silas's voice. "You've disturbed them. They will not forgive." The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of dragging footsteps and something that could only be described as laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. Rachel snapped the recorder off, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to get out of here. She crawled forward, the flashlight beam dancing across the uneven floor. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls pressing closer with every step. As she moved, she heard faint whispers again, but now they were inside her head, each word a needle pricking her thoughts. Why do you run? You belong to us now. Stay. Stay forever. No, Rachel screamed, clutching her head. She pushed forward, her fingers bleeding, as she scrambled over jagged rocks. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Rachel froze. The room was filled with graves, each marked by crude, hand-carved stones. At the center stood Silas Reed, his hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You sought the truth. Here it is." The graves around him began to shift, the earth breaking apart as skeletal hands clawed their way to the surface. Figures began to rise, half-decayed corpses and spectral forms, their mouths open in silent screams. Rachel backed away, her flashlight flickering. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to understand." Silas tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Understanding comes with a price," he said. "You trespassed on hallowed ground. You took what was not yours, images, memories. Now you will give something in return." The whispers grew louder, the figures closing in. Rachel turned to run, but the tunnel was gone, replaced by a solid wall of earth. She pressed herself against it, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. "I didn't mean to—" Silas raised a hand and the whisper stopped. The chamber fell deathly silent. "Your soul," he said simply. "That is the price." Rachel's vision blurred as the figures reached for her, their icy hands gripping her arms, her legs, her neck. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness. Her body was dragged toward the center of the chamber, toward the gaping hole that had opened beneath Silas's feet. As she was pulled into the abyss, Rachel's mind shattered, her thoughts consumed by the whispers. Her last coherent memory was of Silas's voice, calm and final. "You are one of us now." Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled upon Rachel's abandoned car near the cemetery. The doors were locked, her camera and notebook still inside. The authorities searched the grounds, but found no sign of her. The only clue was a photo on her camera, the final image she had taken before vanishing. It showed Silas Reed standing in the fog, his glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. Behind him, a new figure stood among the graves, a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Rachel Ward had become part of the legend, another ghost of the forgotten cemetery.